What would happen if Kong from the Skull Island movie were to fight with George from the Rampage movie? The trees sway to and fro as a soothing wind passes through their lissom branches. Tiny animals emit cries of communication, stating the latest news and proclaiming which males sport the most powerful status and which females are the most fertile. Like death's shadow being cast on the land below, a mighty silence instantaneously overcomes the land. On the plains below, a powerful creature makes his way towards a stream. He'd been dropped here some time ago. He's not sure how long, but his disorientation gives him an idea that it's probably been half a day. The only thing on his mind is water. It's a good thing that his captors had the mind to put him near a water source. As he leans down to drink, dipping his cupped hands below the surface of the water and raising them to his lips, he feels an overwhelming sense of relief as the cool liquid coats the inner lining of his very sore throat. His relief is short-lived when he hears loud thuds in the distance. The 55-foot-tall ape reclines on his back legs and surveys the plains. His name is George, a male albino silverback gorilla. He remembers when not so long ago the man named Davis rescued him and helped raise him. He remembers the unfortunate events of the strange chemical that sprung up into his face and caused him to mutate. His life was never the same after that. He had become much more aggressive and had grown in size and power. He's still growing. During that time he felt nothing but fear, but thanks to his friend, things had become better. Now he is in what he believes to be his new home. He no longer experiences that uncontrollable aggressive nature that he did before. He's had experience fighting two other giants, who too have been mutated due to the strange chemical affecting them as well. He had such a good relationship with his friends, and honestly, being alone right now, he misses them so much, especially Davis. He felt as though this was a new beginning for him, and he trusted that Davis put him in a safe place. He's felt safe. Until now. George now stands up to his full height, staring in the direction from whence he heard the loud thudding. He realizes that this is the sound of footfalls from some sort of creature that is much larger than he is. He is utterly shocked when he beholds a creature that looks like him with black hair and who stands over 100 feet tall, with more proportionate body appendages. George feels fear in his heart, but something draws him towards the strange creature. He knows it's only a matter of time before the creature finds him, and thinks that the creature already knows his location. It's not like George can actually hide from this huge gargantuan beast with his bright white coat. At the same time, he is torn because he wants to stay out of the way of this other male who clearly owns this land. At the last minute, George makes the decision to turn around and put a lot of distance between him and this new male. As he turns around, he is frightened when he comes face to face with a reptilian creature who looks as though the meat had been burned off of its head, leaving nothing but the skull behind. This frightens George and he roars. The creature is a skull crawler, and after it hisses, it attacks George straight away. The one before him is about his size, just about 50 feet tall, but much longer. It wraps his long prehensile tail around George's neck and pulls him to the ground. George despondently flails around, trying to break the tail free from his neck with his fingers, but to no avail. The sinister beast tears into him, and this enrages him. He pounds the creature's abominable face with his thick fists. The creature does not relent. George rolls until he is atop the skullcrawler, with the tail still wrapped around his neck. But before George can even calculate his next move, another creature, smaller than the first, bites into his shoulder. George cries in agony and fear, thinking he's going to die. This was supposed to be a safe place. George fights for his life, but the skullcrawlers are way too powerful for him to defeat on his own, especially since they've teamed up against him. He gets some good hits in, though, but it simply isn't enough. While the grip of the skullcrawler's tail becomes tighter around George's neck, he starts to witness the light dulling from his eyes. He hears the creature screech and were violently taken from off of him. When he looks up, lying on his side and violently inhaling some much-needed oxygen, he sees the large ape that he had witnessed before. As easy as pie, this ape takes the two skullcrawlers by their necks and then bashes their heads together several times until they're lifeless on the ground. He then leaps into the air and stomps on their heads for good measure. George is horrified, but also in awe at what he's just seen. The big ape is Kong, and he turns to him and roars intimidatingly, thinking he's probably another enemy. He's waiting to see if this white newcomer will submit to him, which he does not. Kong will not fight him. He's finally found someone else like him, however. They look similar enough, and as Kong leans down to closer investigate George, this looks like an attack. George yowls and fists Kong in the face. The bigger ape is appalled and unceremoniously shoves George back. George recovers quickly and leaps skillfully into the air with such swiftness that Kong seems to lose his motion. George grabs onto Kong's arm and bites, but maintains the momentum, climbing onto the larger ape's back. The hulking Skull Island ape stands quickly to his full height and beats his chest in anger at this younger individual's insolence. He's especially surprised at how strong the smaller ape is. Little does he know that even for his size, George has enhanced strength. Even still, Kong is able to knock George off after George pummels the back of his head for a while. Grabbing one of George's legs by reaching behind his head, Kong throws him many meters away and roars angrily. But no matter what Kong does to keep the smaller nuisance off of him, George just keeps coming back with a vengeance. He's pint-sized in comparison, but packs a punch of a much larger male, and this confuses Kong. George looks around after leaping off Kong's back moments before the larger ape grabs him again. Kong faces George and seems to make an attempt to communicate with him. George is just too frantic and in battle mode. George finds what he's been searching for. He makes haste on all fours. He runs and shoulders into a large tree, nearly smashing it in half. Realizing he's not felled the tree completely, he looks up at the gigantic crack he's made in it and rams it again until the whole thing creaks and the top part falls over. The tree is not the largest tree he's seen, but it's large enough to do the trick he has in mind. Using his sharp teeth, he goes to the other end of the now broken off trunk and bites away the excess wood to attempt to sharpen it. Kong roars and then watches, totally flabbergasted. George looks at Kong and sneers. On two legs, he holds up the heavy log and aims it at Kong with the tapered side. Kong knows what's up and runs towards him. He makes the move to leap over George, whose momentum is increased by the additional weight of the log. But George foresees this and swings the log up. It connects with Kong's crotch. Kong yelps and is sent off balance, falling onto his head. He is able to put his arms out to catch himself for the most part, but he's still pretty banged up. George does not hesitate to use the log to beat Kong senseless. Kong is still very shocked at how strong this smaller and younger ape is in comparison to himself. In an instant before George can dish out another blow, Kong rolls over into his back and grabs the log mid-swing. George doesn't miss a beat and releases the log to beat Kong in the knees. Honestly, Kong has not been trying to kill this younger ape. He is lonely, and he is just happy that he's found someone else like him. But if they're going to get along, one of them has to establish dominance, and this is Kong's home. He allows George to express his anger, but only for a few more seconds before Kong draws back one of his legs and kicks George square in the face. George rolls back, and it takes him a while to stop. He is still moving back even though he's right side up, and uses his fingers to try and dig into the ground to stop himself from sliding backwards. Kong sneers at him and then releases a soft snarl. George is shocked and is not used to being beaten around by another ape. He assertively barks and beats the ground before him, before charging at Kong once more. As he leaps into the air, George is then face down on the ground in an instant. He realizes that Kong had connected a punch to his nose before he even knew what was going on. George beats the ground again, but every time he tries to get up, Kong uses his fist to push him back down into the dirt. Kong irately roars into George's face, commanding him to stay down and to submit. This just makes George more enraged, and against Kong's force on his back with his fist, George starts to push himself upward against the might of Kong's weight on him. Kong raises his fist momentarily off of George's back to pound him into the ground again, but George just will not give up. Totally miffed and incensed, Kong takes George's two back legs and slams him into the ground about 6 times before tossing him over his head. He takes the log that George had been using to beat him with only moments ago and then swings it towards George. Right as George is hitting the ground, before he can hit the ground again after bouncing off of it, the log connects with his midsection and sends him hurtling away. George screams in exasperation, refusing to denounce his individual sense of authority. They go at this for another half hour, it seems, and Kong is getting tired. Meanwhile, George shows no sense of slowing down. George has adapted throughout the fight and no longer uses close-range attacks, but he takes rocks or any object he can to hurl at Kong. As he passed up the dead skull crawlers, he took 2 of those and hurled them towards Kong as well. Kong ended up tripping over one, the other flying into his face. Kong was so infuriated that he took the skull crawler and then tore it in half, throwing each side back at George. Viscera went everywhere. George has literally been running circles around Kong, and after a while, Kong stops chasing him, realizing what's happening. He is getting even more worn down, and this is probably because George has more stamina. Kong is a much larger creature, and George is more nimble, being able to run on all 4s as well. While Kong seems to relent, George takes his time to charge after him and then start to beat him in the face as he leaps up to meet him. Kong shoves him off, but George tucks and rolls and goes around the backside of Kong. Kong turns around to try and locate where George is, but it's so hard to keep up with him. He doesn't even realize that the albino male is now on his back. He pummels the back of his head, hoping to knock out the larger ape. George foresees that Kong will try to peel him off his back again, so he takes his mighty arms and wraps them around Kong's throat and squeezes. Kong beats his chest and then tries to reach around so that he can pull George off. The albino male is unyielding, and momentarily he will beat Kong in the ears before Kong is able to grab him. Kong falls on all 4s, not only tired and losing his stamina, but also not getting enough oxygen as well. George uses this time to try and beat Kong in the face from behind. In one quick motion, Kong rolls onto his back in an attempt to crush George, who does not let go quick enough. However, this fails to work as George is still hanging on with all his might, his arms still tightly wrapped around Kong's neck. But the more Kong tries to beat him into the ground to get him off, George's grip loosens. Finally, his arms are released from off of Kong's neck, and Kong is able to get up. Before George can run away, Kong, seeing an opportunity with George being on his back, grabs George by the neck and slams him repeatedly into the ground, trying to knock him out. George is now starting to show signs of tiredness. The constant blows to his head with his head connecting with the hard ground does not help. George only wanted to be safe, and if he's going to live here, he knows that he must show his strength to this older male. He never imagined there were other large apes like him, and now he was going to be killed by one. Kong punches his chest and slams him into the ground over and over and over, and then roars into his face. A lengthy and ancient roar that stops George in his tracks. George goes still, and Kong fears the worst. Even though it was annoying having this dwarf attack him, in his mind this is the only other creature that looks like him, and he wanted to connect with this creature, and now he feared that the creature was gone. Kong let go of George and leaned down to sniff him. He raised his arms and they fell lifelessly at the side. Kong experiences the familiar feeling of dolefulness overcome him. What has he done? But George has one more trick up his sleeve. He'd been playing dead this whole time, and as he opens one eye, he realizes that now is his chance to catch Kong off guard. Both fists curl up around some dirt under his hands, and quickly as possible, he takes both his fists up and unleashes the dust in Kong's face. George then reaches forward and bites Kong in the nose. Kong howls in surprise and pain. He has not even made the connection that this is George doing this. He starts beating George in the head with each of his fists, trying desperately to get him off his face. George returns the favor by punching Kong repeatedly in the throat. Kong is still recovering over having lost oxygen, but George does not let up. He keeps punching Kong in the throat over and over, and then in the eyes, until the old ape falls backwards. Kong blinks the tears from out of his eyes, trying to take a breath. George stands over him on his hind legs and beats his chest and roars in Kong's face, then takes both of his fists and starts pummeling Kong's face. It is all Kong can do to keep his face from being smashed up by using both his arms to protect himself. He knocks George away and then grabs him by the arm and slams him into the ground behind him. George takes one of Kong's fingers and bites down hard on it. Using his molars, he chomps down that he takes some flesh with him. Kong rolls over, barely able to breathe, and grabs George by the head once more. George is able to slip him off. Kong realizes it just isn't worth it, and he's not even really trying to kill this younger ape. He just wants him to understand that he's not a threat. But can they even get along if the ape won't listen to him? Kong sees a nearby rock and uses it to slam into George's head. George had not seen this coming, and he wobbles for a while and then holds the side of his head where the rock had connected. He focuses on Kong and then charges again. Kong takes George's head and slams it with the rock over and over. George may just end up fighting to the death, because that's exactly how Kong feels, that this creature will just not stop until he's dead. George focuses again and tries to steady his legs, and then looks at Kong and growls, preparing to charge once more. Kong realizes that this is a lost cause. Every time George attacks, he punches George away, until finally he grabs George by both arms and then starts to pull him slowly apart. George roars in agony and anger. Kong holds him up to his face. This creature is half his size, but now, with his powerful arms incapacitated, Kong has the upper hand, and while he's holding George upward and stretched out like an aerial crucifixion, he uses his massive head to stare George in the eyes and then pummels him with his head as hard as he can. Repeatedly, Kong head smashes George until George is hanging lifeless. Kong makes sure that George is actually unconscious, and when he is, he drags him atop a very tall mountain. This rock formation is like a stone version of a skyscraper that only Kong can climb. Of course, George is a close member of Kong's species, so he could probably get down it if he had to. But Kong would not let that happen. He put George atop it and waits for him to wake up. When George finally regains consciousness and he roars at Kong, before leaping off of the tower, he realizes there's nowhere to go. And if he tries to go anywhere, Kong could just make things very bad for him. Maybe at this height, and isolated like this, Kong can finally get through to George. Kong, being very intelligent, had thought ahead, and as George roars at him and frantically tries to run around the top of the tower wondering how he's going to get down, Kong shows him something. It's a very large red fruit. Kong offers it to George, and as George looks at it, he looks back at Kong thinking it's a trick. George beats it away, and the fruit goes flying. Kong turns around and finds it and retrieves it, only to hold it back up to George. George is untrusting and scowls at Kong. Kong smiles and then takes a bite of the fruit and then offers it to George. This time, George's face softens. This is usually a show of friendship. George sniffs the fruit and then reaches out for it, but then retrieves his hand. He still doesn't trust Kong. So Kong puts the fruit right down before George so he can pick it up himself. Despite his animosity towards the bigger ape, he takes the fruit and plays with it, inspecting what it is. He dips his finger into the soft fleshy part out of which Kong took a bite, and then puts his finger in his mouth to suck on the juices. George is delighted at its sweetness, and he buries his face into it. Kong just stands there watching him. Kong brings him more fruit, and eventually, after some time, George is able to calm down, realizing that Kong is not actually a threat. After a while, Kong tries again to reach his hand out to George. George growls. Then after seeing Kong's hand and looking at his hand, he rolls his hand into a fist and then bumps Kong's finger, the way that he used to do with Davis. Kong copies George's motions and rolls his hand into a fist as well and hangs it in the air, waiting to see what George will do. George takes his fist again and fist bumps Kong. Kong is unsure what this gesture means, but he can tell from George's demeanor and him laughing that it's something friendly. And something happens that hadn't happened in a long time. Kong feels a play at the side of his mouth, and some strange noise is being emitted from him. He realizes that he's doing the same thing George is. He's laughing. Such an alien concept that he believes it's either been a very long time or he's never experienced it before. Alright guys, so that is the end of the theoretical scenario battle. I honestly think that eventually Kong could kill the Rampage gorilla, George would be able to hold it down, but if Kong really wanted to kill him, he could. George does have a lot of more stamina and agility, and if he's resourceful enough with tools or the way that he fights Kong, he could actually kill the larger ape. If he took a spike to his head, George is quick enough and has the ability to leap onto Kong enough to impale him if he really had to. George could only win a fight against Kong relying on his sheer intellect and agility, as well as his stamina, but Kong would win one-on-one in a melee because of his sheer size. It almost seems like a tie, but I think them winning or beating each other is purely situational, even despite George almost being half Kong's size. Anyways, what did you guys think about this theoretical battle? Let us know what you think would have happened and under what circumstance, and thanks so much for watching. This has been Altiori. You ask, we answer.